Welcome to Joining the Dots. I'm Thomas Strowan, your host. This podcast explores real-life insights from those dedicated to pursuing justice, reducing harm, and enhancing global security. As co-founder of Clue Software and a technologist, I collaborate daily with diverse teams tackling some of the most pervasive problems in the world, ranging from child abuse to human trafficking, organised crime, fraud, and much more. In Joining the Dots, I speak with those deeply entrenched in these worlds. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the leaders, the techies, the academics. The often unsung heroes on the front line, working to tirelessly create a safer world. Welcome to Joining the Dots. Hello and welcome to another edition of Joining the Dots. Today we're here with Martin Dubbey, Managing Director of Harrod Associates. Today we're going to be speaking about a number of things, but in particular we're going to be anchoring the conversation in the Sochi scandal. Many will remember this as the Russian doping scandal, which uncovered industrial-scale, government-driven doping, which Martin led the investigation, and it was featured in the Academy Award-winning documentary series Icarus. I only spoke to someone this morning about it who said he watched that documentary twice because he thought it was so good. That was a chap from the NCA. So whilst discussing this, we're also going to take the opportunity to discuss the complex world of statecraft and nation-state investigations, which seems ever more relevant in today's world. And no doubt there will be other anecdotes from a rich life lived in the world of investigations. Martin has had a distinguished career in law enforcement, working at HM Revenue and Customs, as well as the National Crime Agency, or the Serious and Organised Crime Agency as was. He then took the unique set of skills he acquired, Liam Neeson style, during his time, and he set up Harrod, an international investigation company. Along this journey, he has been involved in some very interesting cases. So welcome, Martin.
Thank you, Tom. It's a very kind introduction.
Good to see you, and thank you also. We are here in Harrod offices in London. Thank you very much for hosting us.
You're welcome.
Okay, so let's get straight into it then. Martin, can you give us a few minutes on your background? How have you got to where you are? How did you find yourself doing stuff like investigating dodgy Russians?
Well, it's quite a story, Tom, and I'll do the best I can with that. So I guess my career started in actually Customs and Excise way back when, and perhaps I won't reveal that exactly for your listeners, but gradually worked my way up within Customs, involved in predominantly drugs investigations at various command levels. I was fortunate enough to serve for 4 years as the UK's drug liaison officer in Miami. And as I worked up through my career in the drug side of Customs and Excise, I ultimately became the head of cocaine intelligence, which gave my bank manager a bit of a shock when I told him I made my money from cocaine. And then from there, when the departments merged, initially the revenue with Customs and Excise became HMRC. A year later, I actually moved on to the Serious Organised Crime Agency, where I performed a similar role in cocaine for that agency. I left just before it became the NCA, so I can't actually say I've ever been a serving member of the NCA, although a number of our employees here at Harrod are ex-members. And I left to uh, really see if I could put into practice the experience I'd had in law enforcement, but apply it to the private sector in terms of protecting private sector from the risk of fraud, internet scams, to help them with asset tracing, to help them with court cases, to help them with internet scams in particular, due diligence investigations, and as it was to emerge, sport crime and misconduct. So how did I get into that? I was very fortunate. Around about 2015, I was invited to be a member of a task force looking into international athletics at the time. And this was really my first rub into the Russian involvement in sport. Was that the allegation was that the Russians had been corrupting the anti-doping unit of international athletics, which indeed our inquiry was to show they had. but also to investigate corruption allegations against senior members of the organisation at the time. At the time, it was currently run by Lamine Diak, who was subsequently arrested as a result of our inquiry in relation to the corruption allegations that we made. And from there, we got involved the following year. I thought that was the end of it in terms of sport investigation. But from there, the following year, perhaps one of our number one bad guys from the first year, a guy called Dr. Gregory Rodchenkov, who features mainly in the Icarus documentary, defected to the West, believing that his life was in danger. And consequently, as part of that defection, opened up and cooperated as a whistleblower about what had actually happened at the Sochi Olympics, where wide scale doping had taken place. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more detail momentarily. From there, the sport investigations have run into uh, contract fraud, sexual abuse, corruption, embezzlement. So, really, all aspects of sport misconduct, if you like, whilst at the same time managing a company that continues to look at fraud, asset tracing, due diligence as our mainstream work.
Yeah, okay. And so before we go into a bit on on the Sochi, I am quite interested in our listeners maybe about how you found that transition. You know, you found, now founded and have run for many years a successful private sector organization. Not everyone with your background has that same level of success. So, you know, what was the secret and the challenge?
Okay, well, again, very kind of you, Tom. Thank you. But you know, in terms of the challenge, there is definitely, and I've seen it, a challenge of switching out from official life, where a lot of stuff is done for you, into the private sector, where you really have to think about everything from the bottom up. You know, in the early days, it was thinking not just about where are we going to get work from, because it's a business at the end of the day, but you know, literally who's sweeping the floors, who's arranging the IT, doing the HR, a lot of the basic jobs that in government you do for granted. And of course, the biggest challenge is you're moving into a business environment where, you know, really you have to be earning. You know, it's not the luxury of government. There's a budget provided for you and you get on with it. You actually have to dig in and find the business.
Mm.
In terms of the lessons learned, I felt there were a number of really useful learning points out of my time in government. One, obviously, I had an interesting background which people wanted to hear about, but something that we needed to apply to everyday life in the private sector. If I may give you an example, in the early days, I was a bit puzzled why I wasn't getting work. And I spoke with an old colleague of mine and said, "Any ideas?" And he said, "You know, Martin, the problem is people like you, they like your stories, but they can't envisage what they're going to buy from you in terms of a service." And that was really helpful for me because what I realized was great telling war stories, but really, what are you selling? And so switch that out into things like supply chain, looking at supply chains, protecting your supply chain from the bad guys, all this sort of thing became a much more attractive proposition to potential clients down the pipe. So that was an early learning curve.
Mm.
Having said that, in the private sector, a lot of the sales development is about building up trust, building up relationships, was exactly the bread and butter of what we did and what I did in law enforcement. I think the experience of Miami was a really good example of that.
And this is the Miami experience, just for our listeners?
So the Miami experience was I was posted for 4 years as the drug liaison officer there. And you're really on your own, representing the UK, working amongst all these different US agencies, but with a mandate to develop intelligence for the UK to help stop the flow of drugs to the UK and Europe. And so that's all about building relationships, networking. And I find in the private sector, it's very similar in terms of building trust to develop sales and business leads.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have a number of just unbelievably talented and great ex-law enforcement staff members, and I find the best ones relate what they did in their career and the lessons they learnt in their career in law enforcement into business, because there are parallels. So, you know, I've got a couple of colleagues in business development, you know, or sales, and they look at it and they think, oh, this is a bit like an investigation, because you get leads, you get things that happen that you don't know if they're going to be prevalent to your investigation, but you go and look at them and you triage them and you work out if they are important. And then, if they are, you look a bit more into them. And that's very similar to, bringing a customer into the organization. You're not going to win every organization and customer at this sort of top level. But, when you get down to that bottom, you're going to bring in the customer, or you're going to bring in that piece of killer evidence. So, I think the best people kind of just,
Yeah.
draw these parallels, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely right, Tom. I mean, business development, marketing, sales is not for everyone. And perhaps we found in law enforcement sometimes that there's a reluctance to get involved because I'm an investigator. But here's an important point, the quality of your work is as good a marketing document as anything.
Mm.
If you produce good investigations and things like that, it's good marketing, it's good business development. Success breeds success. So
Yeah.
we're very keen that we maximize everyone's use and experience.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on the business so far. And as I say, it's people listening, that there'll be a lot of inspiration in that, I'm sure. Okay, so should we get into a bit of a discussion on Sochi?
Sure.
For the people, for the benefit of some of the people who haven't watched Icarus recently, I have watched it, not very recently, but it'd be really useful for you. Perhaps you could start at high level and give the listeners a view of the Sochi scandal and your role in that.
Okay. Well, I will have a quick plug here. You've kindly mentioned the Oscar-winning performance that was put in by everyone in the dark drama documentary Icarus. I do feature, but only for about 4 seconds. But I can therefore say I have appeared in an Oscar-winning movie. I just haven't won a personal Oscar, so it gives me something in
Good,
common.
good enough for me.
Something in common with Tom Cruise because he has
Yeah.
also appeared in Oscar-winning movies, but never won a personal Oscar. In terms of high level, Tom, very simply, coming out of the 2015 investigation, which was looking at corruption of um, the anti doping unit there, was a much wider allegation that came from Rodchenkov, the lab director in Moscow, that they had worked out a scheme where they could swap urine samples that were given by athletes with clean samples. So what it meant was that selected athletes at the Sochi Olympics could um, could compete dirty, if you like, taking prohibited substances, steroids, things like that. They could take those substances, compete dirty, but show us a clean result in their athlete sample. So that essentially was the item that um, was the overall allegation. Now, the first instance with that, the first time I met Rodchenkov, and I've debriefed him easily 4 to 5 times, was what I said to him was, "It's great what you're telling us, but you really need to demonstrate. We need to demonstrate this that forensically we can corroborate, or even go beyond the corroboration, prove what you're saying." So that was the starter of the investigation.
Because I suppose on one front you can understand individuals doping because of wanting to win. You could almost understand a coach with a number of individuals, orchestrating something around doping. But this is the next step up, which is the allegation that it's not the individual, it's not the coach, it's not even the governing body, it's the government.
Mm.
That's the kind of the allegation that you're
Abs-
presented with.
Yeah. And Rodchenkov was very clear that this approval for this operation had set up, bearing in mind it cost a lot of money, went right to the very top, approval by President Putin. And interestingly, the backdrop is a very geopolitically charged environment because bear in mind the end of the Sochi Olympics was also the same time at which the Russians invaded Ukraine and took Crimea and parts of the Donbass. So very politically charged at the time, and part of it is around, in my view, a nationalistic desire by a country to do well in the meddling because it high profiles your country. It gives a feel good factor to your country. I mean, I'm sure we all remember London 2012, how
Yeah.
as a nation we all felt great about Britain doing so well in the meddling position. That's exactly what wanted to be achieved at Sochi. and it's the birthplace of Putin. So again, there was an extra agenda item that the Russians really wanted to do well there with an Olympic Games on home territory.
Yeah, and a legitimacy that is given to what dictatorships, should we call them, through sport, which
Absolutely.
is
With experience, I'm sure they're not the only country doing this, but obviously they were caught, in my opinion, in quite spectacular fashion once we'd had the insight of what had been going on at
mm,
Sochi.
mm,
And in fact, from Sochi, we were able to develop this and show that the same scheme that they were running at Sochi had actually been in place for a couple of years, and indeed was going to run on a couple more years after Sochi before it finally closed down. So we were able to capture that whole
mm.
picture, if you like.
So tell me how did you manage to do this from one Russian with some broad allegations to actually proving it?
So, in terms of where the experience came in from law enforcement, I think this probably tested myself and the company. Of course, we were working to the chairmanship on this inquiry with Professor Richard McLaren. But as the chief investigator, really important, first of all, to establish what the testimony was, what the allegation was, and hence the debriefing. Um, but that's great. But where's your corroboration, or where's the forensics around it? So the first allegation is that the Russians were able to somehow uh, swap the urine samples that had been given by athletes during the Sochi event. And, what we needed to prove was that that indeed had happened. And if I can just hold up one of the urine bottles, in fact, there's two that typically an athlete, when they're passing urine for a dope test, will pass their own urine, and this is where hopefully everyone's had their breakfast because we'll get
Yeah,
some gory detail. But the athlete then, once they pass the urine under supervision, pours their urine into each bottle,
yeah.
and there's a bottle A in orange and a bottle B in blue. And the bottle A is, if you like, the working sample. That's the sample that's taken and tested to see if there's any immediacy traces of drugs. The blue bottle is actually usually put in storage for 10 years. And the blue bottle is, taking into account there might be future developments in science or intelligence coming in that ultimately means that the owner of these bottles, usually the IOC or the Sports Federation, can go back and test any time within the 10 years. So the important thing is
Within 10
working
years, just to say that is a
within 10 years, absolutely.
yeah, I mean, that's something that I think is quite interesting. We had, I don't know if you've come across Sarah Lewis.
Yes,
She's the ex involved in the ski federation for many years. But yeah, what I hadn't realized is that doping samples are kept for 10 years. So, you might have had a wonderfully successful career and not got caught, but if a new detection new way of detecting, doping substances appears and old samples get rechecked, you could
absolutely.
realistically get caught
Uh,
post successful career.
and to just bump the story on a bit further, as a consequence of the Sochi investigation, we realized there'd been widespread cheating at the London Olympics by the Russian team. So, of course, what we had was the benefit of being able to go with that intelligence to IOC and say, you need to retest these blue bottles because we can now tell you what was in them. We can tell you that they were deliberately spying on the British lab here in London, and Harlow at the time was the base. So they knew exactly what levels
Mm,
we, the Brits, could test to, and their athletes would dope up to that level. So they weren't caught at the time. And effectively, after that event, I forget the exact numbers, but certainly in the region of 20 to 30 medals were in fact withdrawn from the Russian team as a consequence of that. And it's a sad indictment, but actually, London 2012 went from one of the cleanest Olympics to one of the dirtiest in terms of doping fines. But that was only 4 years after the
mm,
actual event. Going back to the actual Sochi allegation, obviously the clear priority was to say, can these bottles, these tamper-proof bottles, be opened?
mm,
And Rodchenkov said he'd never seen it happen, but they had the assistance of the Russian FSB, that's their intelligence agency, and their intelligence agency had sport as a national intelligence priority.
Yep.
What that meant was they got resources from the FSB to help them in whatever way. And in fact, we identified that there was an FSB liaison officer would actually sit in the Moscow lab and subsequently in the Sochi lab when everything was moved from Moscow to Sochi during the period of the Olympic Games. And one of the key priorities of the FSB was to work out how to get the caps off without showing evidence of that.
Mm.
And
And to be fair and to be clear, just for the benefit of the listeners, yeah, these bottles have what looks like a fairly elaborate, mechanism at the top that is supposed to prevent tampering, right?
absolutely. So you'll see there, Tom, that there's a locking nut and then a screw top on top of that. And once the bottle lids are fully clicked through, it's about 14 clicks.
Right.
And this is significant to fully turn this on, 14 clicks of the lid to get it to that fully sealed position. What we were able to work out was that if you slid something up the inside, usually a metal item, very thin metal item, you could actually pressurize the locking nut to push up sufficiently to disengage from the glass lugs that were holding it in position. And once you disengage that, then you just unscrew it and it comes off. Now, that was not detectable to the human eye. We had to look at it under microscope, so looking at the samples under
Mm.
microscope and seeing that the scratch marks
Up the inside of the bottle.
up inside the
Yeah.
bottle were detectable around the area of the glass lug. That's where they were pushing it up
Yeah.
to try and get it over and above the glass lug on these bottles.
It's ingenious, isn't it, really? And, there's someone from the FSB, that's the right
Yeah,
acronym, isn't it?
absolutely.
Sitting there with one of these bottles, working out how to open it for
Yeah.
God knows how long. They would have been playing around.
And it's a national intelligence requirement. It was part of their
Mm.
requirement to support sport in Russia. So we actually found evidence of post the 2012 London Olympics that actually this whole process of removing the lid started to come into practice in Russia in Russian games, um, particularly around the Moscow Games in 2013. They had the benefit of the lab being in Moscow; they could remove the lids and swap the samples. So with chosen athletes, the benefit is they can compete dirty. And remember that Rodchenkov told us you only need an extra pace, an extra 6 inches of a jump or whatever to get you into a middling position. It doesn't take very much extra to get you in that position. I once asked him, but what about these sports where we don't see doping? What about those? And he said, they're simple, Martin. He said, in those sports, they're all judge related. So we just bribe the judges. It's much easier than going through these doping scams and things like that, which is quite a cynical approach, in my opinion, to what was going on. So our first step was to prove that the lids could come off. And we had one of the lead experts in the UK, firearms expert. And again, you might think, well, that sounds a bit odd, but think about what they do, looking for striations, marks, things like that. And he detected those marks under microscope, and under microscope worked out what they meant, i.e., upward thrusts of probably a metallic substance to or plate to
Mhm.
push that lock nut up. What we subsequently found from forensic examination, remember I said a fully sealed bottle is 14 clicks. Actually, when Russian samples were given, Russian athletes were only pushing it to 7 clicks. So there must have been definitely a conspiracy around that to say don't fully tighten the bottles.
And it was the athlete's responsibility to do that.
It's the athlete's responsibility to tighten the lid.
Right.
So you would think any normal athlete would want that as tight as possible to prevent um, contamination.
Right, okay, yeah.
But in what we were able to say in subsequent scientific tests, and quite remarkable, that the first time the lid went on, it went to 7 clicks, then it was opened, and then it was fully sealed to the 14 clicks. Now, why did they do that? Because obviously at 7, the lid is not fully sitting properly, yeah, not fully engaged. So it's easier to probe up inside than if you were at 14 clicks. Still possible at 14? but you're likely to damage it. So here's, you know, what we say in any investigation, isn't it? Is uh, establish the normal and look for the abnormal. So we found the abnormal that these bottles had been the lids removed. So what's the next stage? We're now looking for evidence in the urine that something had taken place, had been swapped. And they had quite an elaborate scheme that they'd arranged for athletes to provide clean samples 3 or 4 months earlier. Um, but here was the catch for them. As many, I'm sure, listeners will know, urine can be at different colours at different times of the day, depending on what you've eaten, what you've slept, what you've drunk, and everything like that. And that is one of the measures when samples are handed in. What colour is it? Again, apologies for the gory detail. So, if you've passed a sample 3 months earlier that is light coloured, how can you replace a dark coloured urine sample that might be contaminated with some form of
Right.
prohibited substance? And the answer was from Rodchenkov again. What we did was to thicken it up, we added salt and instant coffee.
What?
Yeah, to
Instant.
make it a darker
Yeah.
colour. Now, interestingly, the coffee powder wasn't detectable. That dissolved and everything like that. But obviously, the element of salt was.
Mm.
So what we did was tested all the samples for salt level as an indication of tampering. And we found several examples, many examples, had been contaminated with salt. Even we had some gold medal winners who had an 18% salt level in their urine, which meant they were officially dead.
Right.
We were told only dead people can produce that amount of salt in their urine sample. What's left? So again, we had an anomaly there of the scratches and marks, the salt, and obviously, what's the other aspect of what would help prove our case was DNA. And by and large, the DNA was largely in order because people had given their sample 3 or 4 months earlier. But when you invent a scheme like that, the weakness is humans. Did they follow the instructions properly? And some athletes, I believe, probably had their relatives provide clean samples, so there was a DNA mismatch.
Right.
We had examples of DNA mismatches where there was male and um, female and female. So we could say, hang on a minute, if that sample's gone in, it's been sealed by athlete, how comes there's a DNA mismatch? So that essentially was the main corroboration of the problem at Sochi. There's a lot more evidence there. But the point being is that, you know, witnesses these days are always challenged on their testimony. The challenge is, can we prove what they say through forensic analysis and support? And I have to say, credit to a wide range of British forensic services, we were able to prove that.
That's fascinating. I hadn't remembered or thought from the Icarus around that coffee, the coffee thing. Was there also, and this is just really scraping my memory a little bit, but there was also a process where they drop off into an area, these samples, wasn't there? And a hole in the wall.
Yeah.
What was
Yeah.
that all about?
So here's the thing: is that every Olympic Games has a secure lab.
Yeah.
So the Russians had a problem. How do we get the samples out of the lab so we can swap them and everything like that? So this is where Rodchenkov had made an allegation about a mouse hole that was going from the secure lab into another part of the building that was non-secure. And what they did was they drilled out effectively a mouse hole between the two walls so that a scientist on the inside who knew what was going on could pass out the relevant samples at night to a waiting team that included Rodchenkov and an FSB officer. They could go off, swap the caps around, change the urine samples, and pass it back through the mouse hole. Now, the curious thing about that, again, forensics, we had photographs of that mouse hole. Could we prove it went all the way through the wall? Could we prove it existed? And the answer, again, with specialist forensic analysis, is that yes, we could prove the existence of that mouse hole. So, again, it's all about corroborating the
Mhm.
allegations. To the extent that you mentioned about the coffee powder in the Icarus movie, Icarus really covered the start of the investigation and then the final press review at the end. So we missed out a lot of detail of the investigation. So if anyone's looking for an Icarus Phase 2, uh,
You
let us know.
you know where to knock, absolutely. I suppose one thing that came to mind when you were talking about that is the parallels and the differences of undertaking, investigations into criminals, a common, like where a lot of your, your law enforcement background would have been, as opposed to, investigating stuff that's nation state backed. What's the difference and similarities?
Okay, well, obviously, a nation state is much more empowered and capable than perhaps some organised crime groups, although some people might debate that amongst the drugs organised crime teams and things like that.
Well, you look at some of the mistakes they made. I mean, that feels like a, that it feels a bit amateur. Maybe when you know these things,
It
it
does,
was, yeah,
we thought that, it does with hindsight, but if it hadn't been for
jail,
Rajoff,
yeah,
the case would never have
yeah, yeah.
come to fruition. Without the allegations, no one was anyone the wiser. But it's like any investigation, isn't it? Once you start going and start challenging it, then yeah, it starts to come out, as you were. You mentioned about other challenges around state investigations. We found that effectively you had first world power with all the power of a top level spying agency committing resource against sporting organisations. So really there to
Don't stand a chance,
don't
wasn't
stand a
it?
chance, in my opinion.
Yeah,
We saw over the years we were investigating this, we saw evidence of bribery, corruption, honey traps, surveillance, everything that a first world spying agency might deploy
yeah.
was deployed in support of this scheme to make sure that it went smoothly at the time.
Mm. When we think about statecraft, we think of sport as a means of operating. A and I think it comes across to me that sports are just woefully underprepared for, these very sophisticated government-backed intelligence agencies to tackle any of this sort of stuff. What was your reflections on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sport management, sports are there to lay on sports. Um, but, you have such vast amounts of money involved in sport now, and you have such interest by national state bodies that actually that sort of crowding, if you like, what my real function is, my day job, which is to put on sport events. The thought that you might be pressured into some form of corrupt activity, pressured in contract fraud, to turn a blind eye and things like that is not really what you turn up for on day one when you're there to lay on sports events.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is perhaps some of the tragedy of it out there somewhere. We learned that, for example, the FSB, I mentioned they had an FSB officer in the lab, but they also had an FSB liaison officer for every sport they were interested in. And usually they tended to be the more nationalistic, dare I say, it, macho type sports where it could convey the strengths of Russia. That's what they're really determined to win. Um, and consequently, that FSB liaison officer was there to arrange bribes potentially, to maneuver votes, all this sort of thing. But also, the Russians seemingly were very generous in offering sports organizations venues in Russia. And of course, there's a power play there, isn't it, to say, hey, we've laid on this great event. But of course, the real benefit was that all those events would then come under the direction of the Moscow lab where we knew samples were being manipulated. So it wasn't just Sochi. As our investigation grew, we realized that there'd been a systematic approach to swapping out the urine in bottles that had lasted several years. So there was always a benefit in laying on sports events in Russia. And it looked like, hey, this is great. This helps the sport organization out. It carried favor. But there was a double win for the Russians in that it meant that everything was under control of their Moscow lab.
And do you think that there's lots of hallmarks from that happening now? I mean, you see in the press the fallout between WADA and the Chinese and the US. Do you think these sort of things are still going on? I'm not suggesting that of the nature of the sample sort of stuff, but just this kind of. this nation state sort of statecraft in sport.
I, 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 yeah, thank you, Tom. I was hoping to avoid that one, but as you know, that's highly controversial. And I think my overall comment is when you've got a scenario like that, you must look at it closely and
Mm,
say, is there some kind of systematic approach to
mm.
this, or is there a explanation that satisfies those that are charged with regulation that they can move on from that event?
And what advice would you give to, those in sport responsible for integrity and good governance? What would be your advice to them
So
today?
my advice is to look closely, to challenge, to query what you're being asked to do. You know, if you're being asked to accept a contract, for example, that has a 70% introduction fee for the introducer, then there's something odd there. That is not normal business practice. And so therefore it should be challenged. You know, where does it come from? Do your due diligence properly, thoroughly. Don't accept someone's word for it. These are all basic lessons that I think will help. But the problem is that as sport is increasingly driven by money, you know, these are areas that are subject to shortcuts and perhaps, you know, end justifies the means and everything like that. So my advice is look closely, check it out, do your due diligence and see what's there.
Yeah. Okay. So before we move off sport, because I think perhaps there's a sort of wider, geopolitical angle to this sort of intelligence and statecraft and state investigations that we could perhaps touch on. But are there any other cases in sport that you can highlight that around? You mentioned about corruption, you mentioned about various challenges that you have investigated that you can talk about that you think are important to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, we've been involved in a wide range of what I directly call sport crime, as necessary opposed to sport misconduct, regulatory breach. And under sport crime, I'd say that extends to sexual abuse, extortion, corruption, etc. So, yeah, a wide range, not necessarily involving the Russians. I'm not picking on them all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Um, but, you know, we're called in to investigate complex sport crime scenarios, and our experiences with sport organisations is that they are very good at putting up the barriers and batting off single-led allegations. But when you take all the allegations in a whole, that's when you've got the opportunity to start really digging down and investigating the people involved.
So sport being an example of where nation states, undertake this kind of activity. In the work you undertake, do you see other areas than sport where you're coming across this sort of these sort of cases and this sort of you know level of activity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, some of the fraud cases now, you know, where there's nation state level uh, extraction of funds, flight capital risk from national institutions, national banking institutions, and things like that. You know, there's a whole level of nation state activity around fraud, and financial crime. And
Yeah.
it's often because they got the easy access to the funds, and therefore it's easier to move.
Mm.
And obviously, everyone knows about politically exposed persons and the definition that effectively they have access to funds that maybe they shouldn't be accessing for private reasons. It gives them ease and opportunity to move funds out of national institutions. So the lessons learned, if you like, are very similar to the sporting side of the house. And I think one comment I'd make is that as the years have gone on, it's more and more common to see nation states involved in out and out criminality. And with that out and out criminality becomes a number of risks for the investigators involved because you're at a higher level now and risk of who you're investigating because they're a nation state and therefore they have access to intelligence agencies, military, whatever it is.
Yeah.
That is, I think, a lesson, generic lesson for everyone when they're involved in high level crime investigations.
Yeah, I think you have to be quite careful because I know that you were targeted in some way, weren't you?
Yeah, so we were, as an organization, we saw that, or other organizations, we saw World Anti-Doping Agency were hacked,
Yeah.
the International Olympic Committee were
Yeah.
hacked, um, and we were actually the subject to bot and troll
Yeah.
activity that
Yeah.
attacked us as a company to say that we were, I I think the crazy allegation, was that I was a Western spy. Now for the audience, I'm not, but of course you'd expect me to say that, wouldn't you? But I've been called worse, as perhaps some of your listeners will attest to.
Yeah.
And so actually, hey, it's not such a big deal. But we were attacked by bots and trolls for, funny enough, about 3 solid days. And then as quickly as it started, it stopped. And that indicated to me that this sort of Russian network of disinformation was absolutely working to order, attain this subject for this period of time, then move on to something else. It was very much under control. And we've seen how disinformation works in perhaps more recent examples and things like that. But it was an interesting learning curve. So again, it's an area where the state media can be empowered to attack you as an organization, to perhaps cast
Yeah.
doubt on the credibility of an investigation and things like that. Um, I think that's just one of the areas that you have to be aware of these
I
days.
guess if it starts happening, then the clues are you're probably onto something. That's one of the challenges.
Well, we always say that in interview, if you start seeing the right reactions, it means that you're getting somewhere. If people start to get heated or smoke screen in interview, then you seem to be getting somewhere. Uh, so the same applies equally to investigations. That the more you rattle the cage, then the more likely you are to get a comeback or blowback from
Yeah.
that information.
Yeah. This morning we had an interesting conversation with the National Economic Crime Centre, who collaborate globally on some of the biggest, most serious cases of economic crime and fraud. Um, and I asked him a similar question to you, which I'm going to ask now. He comes from the sort of statutory area, and it'd be interesting to get your view from the private sector in undertaking this. But basically, what what this chap was saying is that they with our allies, the Five Eyes and those, we get some very very good collaboration in lots of ways and intelligence sharing. And I'd be interested to know if you see something similar within that sort of network. But he said less so with non-allied countries when it comes to he drew a difference between money laundering, where lots of nations don't like to you know, admit that they are part of the problem. I mean, obviously the UK has got a challenge with the money flows, but so do lots of other nations. But often you won't get the level of collaboration with these nations. But he contrasted it with fraud, which I thought was quite interesting. We said actually, fraud, as it's different from higher level economic crime, because it targets the individual and because it defrauds the individual, you often get a good level of collaboration with nation states you wouldn't necessarily think would be particularly allied to, say, the UK. And the examples used are the Southeast Asian fraud boiler rooms, and the West African fraud centres that we read about. He was quite complimentary about the collaboration he's able to
Yeah.
to get there. I just wonder what it looks like from your side of it when you're doing international
Mm.
investigations.
Well, I guess as long as you don't disrupt any nation state fraud going on, and there is evidence of that going on, and so perhaps it depends on your target and your subject of interest. So yes, I can see about the collaboration, etc., for sure. In the private sector now, obviously, we don't have the same powers as law enforcement and the same international cooperation. But there are areas that we can work and be more agile in that perhaps law enforcement can't because of bilateral agreements and things like that. And also working closely with law firms, the integration of working between investigator and lawyer is absolutely critical to what you do here. And of course, to some extent, a lot of the work you do in trying to prove the case is by persuasion, by natural support of the law enforcement powers at times. So, for example, Rodchenkov, when he was cooperating with us, was under FBI cooperation agreement. That meant he couldn't lie. If he was caught lying, he'd be sent back to Russia. So, although they weren't interfering, FBI weren't duly interested in our investigation, it was very much that we could hang out that if he didn't cooperate fully, then he was under this FBI mandate, if you like, to cooperate as part of his ongoing collaboration. So, there are ways of working it. I think your experience of law enforcement is very helpful in this situation, understanding where that agency might be coming from, your ability to persuade them to participate in an investigation, to support an investigation whilst recognizing that there are areas of information they can't give you. It's more perhaps about giving them the ammunition to go on and investigate in some cases. Um, but ultimately, there is a fallback to civil powers and that sort of thing. Again, difficult in sport, um, but and I could think of a couple of areas where it would have been very useful to have law enforcement powers, but you don't have it, so you have to do the best you can in those circumstances. And when you pass a case over to law enforcement, that has to be very clear, presented with the evidence about where they need to then next take the case.
Yes, yeah. Well, I've spoken to various people who are, again, outside of statutory in the sports sector, so in sports governing bodies within integrity units, who are investigating match fixing or other things, and they don't have these statutory powers. But basically, what they say, which I think is what you're saying, is that ultimately these local law enforcement agencies, whether they be in Spain, Thailand, Venezuela, wherever, everyone has too much work to do. They've got a lot of priorities going on. So if there's a trusted organization that is investigating in a way that is compliant with, whatever court that is relevant in that context, and presenting information, case file information, in a way that a law enforcement organization understands, then they are more likely to help you. To deliver the case on a silver platter might be another way to put it. Whereas if you don't have that reputation and you don't have that rigor and you're presenting back of a fag packet allegations, you're unlikely to be, that successful in these sort of international areas.
It's really important. If you think you have got a case these days that you're going to present to law enforcement, it really has to be topped and tailed as best you can, because you're competing for rival interests, if you like, or different interests. So it has to be very attractive, very on a plate to get that cooperation.
Mm.
And in the sport arena, shout out to Australia, Austria, and I believe Netherlands. They have specific police integrity units that enforce sport law
Yeah,
in their
yeah.
respective countries. I apologise, I probably missed some there, but certainly these are agencies that we've worked with.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So the last bit of our podcast that we do is we start to think about what the world might look like in 2030. We've been talking about, first of all, and there's two parts to this, isn't there? There's part which is, the doping in sport, the nation state sort of backed sort of area that we talk about. I wonder if you could reflect a bit on, where that's going and where you see that sort of world progressing. And then maybe also, if we get time, a bit more widely on just the geopolitics of today and where this is going on a wider basis.
Might be retired by 2030, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but seriously, there are some challenges. We can see these challenges growing. I think the growth of online betting is clearly a big issue for sport. This has made it huge money, difficult to enforce because it's multi-jurisdictional, transnational, and the growth in online betting makes it easier to fix events as well. A lot of like the old days, we need a cooperation of a whole team that they're going to win as opposed to the other team losing. You could maybe have a bet on yellow cards to be issued in a half or at a certain time or whatever. So online betting is a definite challenge for sport and the amount of money that it brings into the sport. Because again, if you become reliant on the money as sponsorship, then it's difficult to get away from that.
Yeah.
Second thing is, AI, the power of the internet. What's that going to bring around, fake reporting, fake news, fake stories, where again that may assist criminal activity. Those are the two big challenges I see up and coming for the future in terms of immediacy of investigating. But you're right. Well, let's be honest. You've picked a time to do this podcast 6 weeks into
Yeah, yeah.
a new term for President Trump, and what's happening in the US is still not clear about funding of agencies and organizations that have traditionally been quick to take up the baton globally of tackling some of these fraud issues, some of these sport corruption issues. I hope it doesn't, but we obviously have to see how geopolitically events change that environment over the next few years. That would be my challenge there. I would go back to the point I made that if you're in a position of authority in the sport management arena, in integrity or whatever, then do think about looking closely, do think about challenging, do think about not accepting the first answer, and definitely do your due diligence.
And do you think, just finally, do you think there's an underinvestment in sport, in, integrity and quality of governance that needs to be addressed?
Well, I think this is a common theme that I hear around sport that, again, it's not an earning area, so therefore it's not going to get as much resource as perhaps is needed. It's difficult for sport. Investigations are expensive. We try to use technologies to cut down the length and period of investigations to make them less expensive for sports organisations. But we do accept that investigations are expensive for sports organisations. So, yeah, there is a challenge there with funding. Of course, organisations need that extra push. I would say, my experience is if you've got big sponsors coming in, that really part of your pitch should be as a contribution towards the integrity aspects of the sport. That's got to be in the sponsor's best interest, isn't it? That
Mm.
the integrity of your sport is 100%.
And do you think there's a business case for um, investing in good governance and compliance and intelligence that can help you to perhaps get upstream and prevent some of the things happening that actually prevent? I mean, it's the amount of sports governing bodies that I know that spend so much money on lawyers in the sense of dealing with the reactive things that happen as a result of not having the governance in place. Do you think there's a business case to say beyond simply you need to spend more? It's actually you're going to save money if you put investment in the right place. You might actually stop that huge amount of legal expense that goes out on trying to fix these things that have gone wrong.
Mm. Absolutely, Tom. I mean, it's an old adage, goes back to my law enforcement times, prevention is better than cure. And in terms of that prevention, that is usually cheaper than the cure. Like you say, vast fees in trying to sort out problems that could have been prevented through, for example, investment in proper governance procedures, particularly around due diligence, but also in terms of acting early. Also, in terms of in law enforcement, we found that we couldn't arrest our way out of a problem. Arrest and court prosecution was often a part of the solution, but not the full solution. So, definitely education has to feature in what people are seeing, the opportunities for intelligence development, whistleblowing, all those aspects. It's really vital to keep those systems up to speed and everything like that because you don't want to suddenly find that you've got a big problem on your hands.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Martin. Good to have this session. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you, Tom. Much
Thank you.
appreciated.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Joining the Dots with me, Thomas Drone. We hope you found today's conversation practical and insightful. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to uncover the stories of those on the front line of justice, harm reduction and global security. This is Thomas Drone, signing off. Thanks for listening.